Good evening, everyone. Dobro večer svima. I'm sure you're all aware that this conversation is going to be in English, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all tonight here to spend some time with our dear guest, LEA YPI, and we are really honored to have her with us tonight. And I think you probably, by the number of you being here, I think you're all probably aware of her work and importance of her work in the modern society with her book, and but especially in her field of philosophy. And she's also a professor at the London School of Economics, and she is being considered to be one of the most important thinkers in our era. So I feel really humbled and privileged to sit here and try to be as smart as I possibly can in asking questions. But the main reason that we are here tonight is to speak about this amazing book called Free, or Slobodna in Bosnian and Croatian and Serbian as well, which I all consider one language. And it's a story of Lea's, it's an autobiographical book of Lea's childhood and growing up in Albania. So first of all, thank you, Lea, for being with us here. It's lovely to have you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. It's my first time in Bosnia, so I'm very excited.
Well, the title of the book is Free, but the way it's translated, as you're probably aware, to our language, it's free as a free woman, because we do have these like deciding particles of the word. Totally wrong way to say it, because I can't remember it in English, but I think you know what I mean. And he speaks about freedom, and that's the theme that kind of goes through whole out of the book. And what I really was kind of impressed without even knowing like how much you are involved in philosophy, one could see starting to read that was your main approach as a child as well, to start thinking in philosophical terms, like asking the right questions and like thinking of choice and freedom and things like that. So the way you start writing the book, or the way your narrator, or you in this case, start talking, it feels like going on a certain type of quest for the truth, or even more quest to asking the right questions. Does that feel like something that was really conscious for you, or was it something that kind of came naturally without even being considered?
Yeah, I think it was conscious in that I knew that I was going to write about freedom, but I wanted to write about freedom also in a way that would give as much freedom to the reader to infer what they thought about freedom. I wanted to write about freedom in a way that was not paternalistic and that wouldn't tell the reader what freedom is. Because I think one of the greatest contributions that literature makes to human knowledge is that it builds on giving the reader the benefit of the doubt and not patronizing them, unlike philosophy, which is another thing that I do in my day job, where you always start as a writer with a thesis and you try to prove your adversaries wrong and you try to show their criticism, their limits, and so you build into a philosophical theory, but in a way that always speaks to the reader. And in literature, I think you take the reader on a journey, and especially in a book about freedom, it was very important to me that you wouldn't, because it would almost be an act of taking away the freedom of the reader to define it and to give them a set of concepts and to teach what freedom is, and so to adopt this lecturing or professorial academic perspective. And the best way to do that was to take the standpoint of someone who doesn't have their own views. Because it's very challenging for a writer that has spent their life, their academic life, writing about freedom. It's very challenging when you start writing as a literary author to write it in a way that doesn't one way or another patronize, because you've done this all your life and you have these patterns of thought and patterns of learning. So the way for me to liberate the writer from the academic and from the philosopher was to enter the world of a child. Because a child doesn't have their own view of freedom. They question everything, and I think that's actually the best thing you could do when you want to exercise freedom, is to question everything. And children always have like a lot of questions. They are, I think, the age in which we are not afraid of asking questions. This is what distinguishes a child from an adult. Adult people decide that these are good questions and indeed are bad questions, and some questions are worth asking, some other questions are not worth asking. Children don't have this because they're not, in that sense, they have more freedom to just say, well, at the age of 4, I remember my kids started asking, but why do we have to die? And it was really hard to explain to a child this. But I don't remember asking this question, and yet I must have done at that age. And it's because you are taught that some things are worth thinking about and challenging and criticizing and wondering about, and others are not. So I wanted to be as radical as possible in my approach to freedom, but I wanted to also liberate the main narrator of the book from the constraints of academia, of philosophy, of patterned ways of thinking. And adopting the child perspective was the most effective way for me as a writer to do it, because once you enter in the child's world and you want to explain everything from the child's perspective, then you're doing it in an anti-ideological way, or as much as it's possible. And so you're exercising the same freedom that you want to give the reader, you are also exercising the same discipline as a writer. And that's why this world is reconstructed all from the perspective of a child, with the same naivety, with the same curiosity, with the same belief in all kinds of structures, the family, the state, the society, and with the same sincerity in wanting to actually find the answer.
Yeah, but you also have the tiny, let's say, problem that your character is dealing with, in a sense that she feels troubled, that she doesn't know what are all the questions that needed to be asked. So like the limitation of the age would be there as something coming from the other direction.
Yeah, but I think it's a productive tension, because I think the child is in a way both very much in the grip of ideology, but also has this naivety where in the crucial moments of the book, which are moments of tension where the adults are trying to conceal some truth from her, she also asks the most naive question, which turns out to also be the most devastating question for the family. You know, when she says, for example, there is a point where I discuss the death of Enver Hoxha, and she says to the parents, "You don't seem to love Enver Hoxha." And this is like a prison sentence for someone in that context. And yet the child has this ability to, with this naivety, touch the most problematic aspect of a society under censorship. And for me, this tension, the fact that the child is both at the grip of ideology, but also in some ways has this capacity to rise above ideology by asking these difficult questions, is a productive tension. And I think a lot of adults could do worse than reliving the child in them, in their approach to the world more generally, because I think often we engage with our political reality, with society, with the various power structures that constrain us in a way that would benefit from retaking this child perspective and saying, but does it have to be like this? Or do I have to do this? And ask these questions. And I think it would be a productive political stance to re-adopt this perspective.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, because you're speaking, obviously. I mean, I just have to kind of digress a bit. listening to them and I'm thinking, oh my God, I envy your students because you speak so beautifully. Just going like, yes, yes, I agree. So like I kind of lost myself for a moment there. But the other thing I kind of wanted to mention is, for me, I mean, we grew up in neighboring countries at the time, and then we didn't really know that much about Albania. We knew that like it was like a dictatorship in a while. The time of the Hoxha's rule was like really difficult. We knew it was extremely poor and so on, but like the actual details of the real life are really unfamiliar, at least to me, and I think to majority of people of my generation. So to read this book and discover so many things, similarities that we have, like tiny details like chewing gums from abroad, or in your case it wasn't even chewing gums, it was like paper wrappers for the chewing gums and things like that. So it was like discovering a whole new life that's similar to us, but also like really foreign and different. And like you grew up as Enved pioneers, that was the term used, right? So, and the book starts with your questioning of this system that you live in being in kind of discrepancy with something that you sense with your parents, as you mentioned with the photographs, and you don't love them. So it was all kind of to do with the family's background, or the term that you used is biography. So everyone's life in Albania that I've learned was determined by their biography. So could you tell us more about like what it really stands for? It was almost like a genetic code of you or something like that, just kind of determined you in every sense.
Yeah, so is this not something you had in Yugoslavia, biography? Was this?
Not in such a way, no.
In Albania, so this is maybe something that then it's quite specific, because in Albania, everyone who, for example, had to apply for a job or a promotion at work, or even if you were at school, you were asked, what is your biography like? And for me, biography was one of these words that I learned very, very soon. But as all the important words, you never question them, and you don't ask what is the meaning of this word, because it's supposed to be evident. And so with all the most tricky concepts, it's exactly those that you don't ask what is it, that usually pack more in them. And so all I knew when I was a child were that biographies were good or bad, they were clean or stained, they were biographies that had started in a bad way but were then improving. So biography was basically your passport to life. And usually what it meant was what kind of family background you have. And so, for example, if you came from a family whose grandfather had been a partisan, this was a very good biography. And then a bad biography, usually children like me wouldn't know what that meant. Parents knew everything about it. So bad biography was someone who came from the old bourgeoisie, or from the landowning elite, or from the Bey, sort of old Ottoman Empire, aristocracy, and so on. But all you knew was that all you needed to say was, it's not a good biography. And that people would know that this was something that was a target of class struggle during communism, and that you'd never get into the party, you'd never get a promotion at work, you'd have to be careful. And for me, I grew up having a sense that my biography wasn't great, but not really knowing exactly what that entailed, because also my parents didn't talk about the political situation of the family and where my grandfather had come from. So they used code language to talk about the political situation. And so I grew up with a sense that, for example, all my friends on 5th of May, which was this partisan celebration of the fallen heroes of World War II, and everyone who had a relative that had fought in the war, this was a source of pride, and everybody would go out to school and say, I have this hero, was my uncle, blah, blah, blah. And I knew we didn't have anyone like that in my family. The thing that I did not know was that not only did we not have partisans in the family, but that we actually had fascist collaborators. And so this was what made the biography stained and not clean. But this was not something that I only discovered when the regime fell, because that was the point where I understood that what I had believed up to that point, which was that Albania was the freest country in the world, and that all the rest of the society envied us for all the privileges that we had and the way we lived and so on. and what my family believed, which was that this was the most oppressive society in the world. These were two very different truths that lived under one roof, but one in the perspective of the child and the other one in the adults.
That was kind of typical to our country, I believe in as well. So if the parents didn't really agree with the politics, they would never discuss it, or they would use some code words for it. But the way you almost do kind of deconstruction of the language, like two different types of not only terminologies, but like the whole systems that construct reality during the socialism. It was like the terms that were constantly used, like working class or biography or this and that. What I found really interesting is university. I must admit, in the beginning, I kind of sensed what you talking about, but wasn't really sure until you literally explained it. So what the university was, and like people were graduating, and so that was really interesting to us as well. If you wanna,
yeah, I can say it, but it would be a massive plot spoiler.
Right.
But
okay, sorry.
I mean, and I think, unlike with my other book, where there is also a big plot spoiler, and I found a good way around it, with this one, I haven't found a good way around it, other than saying that my family talked a lot about universities and who graduated and who didn't, who fell out and who managed, but the universities were not universities.
So you better buy the book and then learn about it. But then also,
But more generally, maybe there's something more general that we can say, which is that I suppose the way you navigate censorship in a society like that is by just finding symbols and codes and ways of being and saying things that aren't exactly the word, but you somehow get around it. And so one example was uncle was always mentioned in my family, and I didn't understand that uncle was Enver Hoxha. So everybody was like, uncle did this, uncle did that, and I always remember thinking, who is this uncle? But then that was the way in which, and this is the way in which, the way they had found to navigate censorship, which is, I think, also really important when you think about societies, totalitarian societies, because the view from the outside is that in a society of censorship, there is absolutely no room for dissent and nothing people can do or say. And in that sense, there is also denial of agency that comes with thinking of those societies where nothing is possible to be said. And actually, if you live inside, you realize that there is a criticism of the system, there is a criticism of society, there is a way of channeling dissidence. It just doesn't take the form that a liberal, democratic, voting society would recognize as dissidence, because they think dissident is just marching on the streets, and they don't think that dissidence can be also, you know, putting a Coca-Cola can right next to the photograph of Enver Hoxha, for example. And that, you know, you have a symbol of imperialism and then the symbol of the party, and they're right there in the living room of someone, and that is also a political expression of some kind. But you wouldn't necessarily, outside the code, wouldn't necessarily read that as an act of political expression.
Well, definitely, it reads that way in a novel as well. But like, to stay on the subject of language and terminology and how the systems are based or created by it or constructed at least by it, like the change of the language and terminology in socialist society, and then after the first free election, and like a country going into transition, having all this new terminology. I remember I spent my I think formative years from 19 till 25 living in London as a refugee, and then I returned back to Bosnia in 1997, and I was really confused. I felt like I really missed on something. There was all this new terminology that I didn't really know what it means and what it entails, and kind of, I think you illustrate that really well.
And I think that's because every ideology needs a language and a map of concepts that make that ideology reinforce itself and reproduce itself. And so in socialism, it was the party, the working class, class struggle. These were the terms that you would, imperialism, solidarity with oppressed people around the world, and so on. So these were the words that you would have to keep expressing to signal that your loyalty to the system. But I also think that even in capitalist societies, there is an ideology and there is a language that gets reproduced that also makes loyalty more consolidated. So anyone who was in Albania in the early 90s, and probably still now, and had to write a grant for some NGO application with external funds from somewhere, knew that they had to use a certain kind of language to get the grants. And so they would talk about civil society, and they would talk about civic initiatives, and they would talk about the importance of building initiatives from below. Anyone who's applied for, still to this day in academia, for an EU grant knows that acronyms are really important. So actually it's really how you call it, whether you call it action something or energy or whatever. The acronym is crucial to whether you get the money or not. So I think, and these are very innocent examples, but I do think that in this transition from socialism to capitalism, new categories emerged, and those categories of individual responsibility or civic activism or civil society replaced the old categories and had themselves an ideological reproduction function that we don't necessarily now question, because we think we live in a world of freedom and this is somehow natural, but it's not natural. And the best way to test that it's not natural is to see this context of transition, where literally overnight Marx and Engels are out of the window, and you have Hayek and Friedman, and one has one language and the other has another language, and people literally start learning this new language that is required for them to advance. And I think, as I say, this is just as an example to try and distinguish between the idea of freedom and the ideology of freedom, which requires you to master a certain kind of acceptable and unacceptable uses of freedom in society. So now you have in free market capitalist societies, you have individual initiative and you have individual responsibility, and somehow poverty is someone's fault rather than the fault of the system. And all of these things are there to normalize compliance and to make sure that the system runs as it's supposed to run.
I think you really beautifully throughout the book, like with the changes of the system in Albania, illustrate that freedom as such doesn't really exist. It's like a different kinds of repression in different systems or societies, and but still it doesn't read as something pessimistic. It doesn't read as you don't believe freedom is possible. It just, I guess it kind of goes to the beginning when you said you didn't really go, you really wanted to kind of stay in the area of questions instead of giving answers. But still, I kind of sensed positivity, optimism. So how?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's optimism, but for me, there is something about just being committed to doing things that is itself optimistic. I don't think we would go to a book festival and we would have a book discussion and we would get up in the morning to do anything, you know, take our kids to school or go to work, if we didn't live life with a sense of achievement and mission and commitment to doing certain things that make us all produce together communication and change and so on. So, and this is now beyond every ideology. I really believe that the narrative that says, oh, it's so terrible and it's like there's no hope out there, this to me is very self-indulgent, because actually you're showing your hope as you're acting, as you're talking, as you're going to work. And these are all manifestations of hope. There is a really wonderful Russian novel, maybe some people here have read it, called Oblomov, who for the the main character of which, in the first 100 pages, can't get out of bed. So he wakes up in the morning, and the first really literally 100 pages are all about how he cannot get out of bed because he doesn't think there's any point in. It's a radically pessimistic, nihilistic novel, which shows the nihilism by just giving you this character who cannot. It starts by saying, and this guy woke up, Oblomov woke up, and he tried to get his slippers, and then he changed his mind, went back to bed, covered himself, then he tried again, and it was so hard. That is really having no hope. It's that radical. It's so radical that he doesn't even kill himself. Because even killing yourself would be somehow wanting to show something to the world, taking a stance. So the radical pessimism and the radical lack of hope is just this paralysis of not being able to get out of bed. And most people are not like that. So for me, then the further questions of, is there hope, is there not hope, is it optimistic, is it pessimistic, this is just sort of a waste of time in a way. Because for me, the important message there is, well, what are you going to do about it?
Oh, definitely. I was just thinking in a sense of freedom, like, is freedom even achievable? Is there a possibility of the society that would have something that we kind of could call freedom? Is it possible to be free at all or not?
Well, let me put it this way. It's necessary to think that it's possible. This is why I started by talking about these acts of hope, these everyday acts of hope, because for me, all that it takes to believe in freedom is to understand the sense of moral responsibility. So whenever there is responsibility, whenever there is agency, whenever there is a sense of why am I acting, what is the point of my actions, what is the point of my communication with other people, there is a recognition of this dimension of commitment that is itself understanding that there is freedom. And then whether that freedom gets realized by institutions, that's a completely different question. But at this existential level, it's important for us to think that we are beings that can engage with the concept of freedom in this way, because that's actually where the social critique starts. If you think it's pointless, then it's pointless to criticize society, it's pointless to try and change it, it's pointless to do anything, you just kind of comply and reproduce these patterns. It only makes sense if you first recognize that there's this internal dimension of freedom that is manifested in this moment of moral responsibility, and then the gap between this responsibility that you feel as an agent and the lack of freedom in the social structures that surround you of one kind or other, and it's in the gap between those two that I think starts social critique.
There's another thing that I would really like to talk about when you speak about like Albania becoming a free country, having first free election, which was in 1990, and then you had like a civil war, not like, you had a civil war in 1997. So the Albania kind of opened as a country and you were free to leave. And you comment that up to till point, the foreigners who were coming, they were very critical of the society in Albania. And then once you had the opportunity to leave, it was impossible for Albanians to be leaving their country and be accepted in other countries. So what I'm talking about actually is like the question of immigration and like asylum seekers in different countries and so on. So today, with the migrant crisis being still very acute, and with the things happening in Palestine and all these monstrosities, in my opinion, that we're kind of facing every day, I would like if you would care to give a comment about like issues of migration in the world today.
Yeah, so I think migration for me is a really important lens through which you can see the ideology of freedom that surrounds us. And exactly in this question of freedom of movement. Freedom of movement is one crucial dimension of freedom, but freedom of movement has two components. You have the right to leave and the right to enter. So you have freedom to exit and freedom to enter. And this for me maybe was one of the first times where I started thinking about what does freedom mean, was exactly this experience I made of freedom of movement. Because I grew up in Durrës in Albania, which was by the Adriatic Sea. And in communism, you had no freedom of movement. Your state wouldn't let you, unlike Yugoslavia, we couldn't leave our country. We didn't get passports. It was completely restricted. It was like an open-air prison. You knew that Italy was on the other side. We picked up Italian signal from television, so everybody was fiddling with their antennas on the roof all the time to try and get Albano and Romina and Toto Cutugno and all this kind of stuff. But basically, you had no freedom to leave. And in fact, the people who did leave were immediately heroes in the West, because they went to tell the story of this brutal oppressive system that would stop its citizens from leaving. And if you go now to the Berlin Wall, you'll see all the photographs of the people who were shot in trying to leave Eastern Germany. So this wasn't just Albania, it was a story that, as I say, maybe with the exception of Yugoslavia, it was generally the pattern in a lot of communist countries. So what happened, and this is why I think this was the first time I thought about this ideology of freedom. Then Durrës went from being a city of picking up the antenna and fiddling with this Italian television to being a city of migrants, because that's where the first boats left to Italy, and like thousands of people that were going to Bari and Brindisi and trying to find a better life. And I remember in August 1991 there was this boat called Vlora, which where the first wave of immigrants, they were received and welcome and so on, and the second one in August, they were all locked in a stadium and kept there, and all kinds of horrible stories happened in that stadium and then sent back to, which is nothing unusual now if you think about the history of immigration in Europe, but at that point it was really striking because the narrative was, well, you know, this is a real danger to society. These are people who we don't know what they're going to become. And the narrative around Albanians were that suddenly they were criminals and people smugglers and sex traffickers and so on. So these people who had been heroes until literally 6 months before within 6 months became the greatest danger to European civilization. And yet you ask yourself the question, what does freedom mean? If freedom of movement has both the freedom to exit and the freedom to enter, what does the freedom to exit mean? And so why were these states called criminal when they were policing the freedom to exit, when then what you do is the moment they're free to leave, you police your own borders, and so then you have these Mediterranean patrol boats and people drowning at sea, and nothing, as I say, nothing unusual, because it's still that story. And those are suddenly defending civilization, so nobody's saying they're criminal. Every day, in the wall between Mexico and the United States, more people die than in the Berlin Wall. So this is, anyone can go and check these statistics. Nobody is talking about this wall between Mexico and the United States as like this state that is criminal. I mean, now with ICE there is a bit more progressive analysis of what's, but the handling of migration is such a clear example of the ideology of how a system naturalizes some things, naturalizes deportation, naturalizes killing at the border, naturalizes drowning people at sea, creating prisons in another third state for in the name of solving the migration problem. And then you just go back a few years and you realize the discourse around communist countries was that they are criminals because they're not letting their citizens out. And so for me, this asymmetry in entry and exit is really, really revealing around the ideology of freedom and oppression of our time. And that's why I spend a lot of my time working on migration, researching and writing about it.
Yeah. It is such. Thank you. Another question that comes to mind talking about going back to Albanians at the time and like not being able to exit the country but not being able to enter another country is this whole I'm lacking the word in English now, but let's say thing for the lack of a better word, that was really big at the time, and that really applied to Bosnian as well, that we are the people who need to be civilized, applying that we are not, without even questioning what civilized is and what civilization is and so on. So like this stigma that was applied to both of our nations as being the lesser people. And I was wondering, like, some of your additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I don't know if anyone has seen this manifesto. There's this poster in the United States. I found this in a shop at Berkeley, actually, when I went for a conference. There was this poster with indigenous people on the poster, which says, "Fighting illegal immigrants since 1492." And so, and this, what you said about civilization made me think about this, because this is another example where the history of my adopted country, the United Kingdom, is a history of forced civilization that leads to genocide of all kinds of cultures and countries and places with history and so on. And yet we still have the belief that these institutions are the core, the apex of freedom and universality and equality and so on. And that we have this story to tell about, for example, you know, the European values, which, of course, there are a lot of European values, but there's also a lot of violations of values. And so, the history of Europe is the history of both. It's the history of Holocaust as it is the history of European values. And these are all political projects. So if you don't have a much more nuanced and specific discussion around what does this mean, it's really, really hard to make progress without then just reproducing these narratives of the civilized and the civilizing forces.
I was going to, because we don't have that much time left, I was going to ask for audience to ask some questions, but there's another thing that I would like to ask first, because there's so many things actually I would love to ask you, but just one more. So like you speak in the book about, let's say, difference or discrepancy between the idea of feminism, without maybe necessarily being called that, in generations in Albania, and Western feminism. There was this amazing episode in a book that I absolutely love about French delegation with French women coming to your house with your mother there, and the way your mother was opposing the idea of feminism. Affirmative action was the word. So how do you see Western feminism in regard to the feminism in, let's say, Eastern European countries?
Yeah, so maybe this, if I tell the story of the book, it's maybe easier to sort of introduce this conversation. But there was this point in the 90s where this delegation of French feminists came to our house in Albania, and they asked my mother if she had experienced harassment. And okay, the backstory is that my mother somehow was showing in a kind of satin dressing gown because she thought that this was like the apex of Western fashion, and so she welcomed these Western feminists with this like super sexy like satin dressing gown which she'd never worn before. But anyway, so that's the sort of the difference in perceptions. And then they asked her, and then I remember this very clearly because my grandmother was translating from French, and they asked her, so have you ever experienced harassment? And my mom didn't understand the words. And so first she asked for clarification, what does harassment mean? And they somehow explained. And then my mom said, no, I didn't experience harassment because I always carried a knife. And then she told the story of how when she was a teacher in this remote village in northern Albania, she had to hitchhike from truck drivers because there wasn't public transport and it was very difficult. And so in these hitchhikes, she was always exposed to drunken truck drivers and stuff. And the way she had solved this problem was by carrying this massive sharp knife with her, which she put in her shoe. And that the one time where she was actually harassed by someone, she literally stuck this in the person's hand. And my mom and the Western feminists, they heard this, and they couldn't understand what it meant. And then she started going on another tirade about how, because in the great free country of the United States of America, people were allowed to carry guns, but in Albania we were not allowed to carry guns. The only thing she could carry was this knife. And so, and therefore, all of the way in which the public was receiving this, the sort of interlocutors were receiving this, was subverting the entire somehow narrative about women being victims. But of course, the backstory was that she was just as much a victim, because of course you don't need to carry a knife, and the discussion needed to be carried differently. But somehow this tokenistic, new ideological way of talking about feminism, for example, which was quotas and changing the language and saying he, she. This was not something that it registered with her or that she cared at all about. And in fact, she was in an association of women immigrant mothers. And I remember at the time she was really, really angry because the Western feminist associations that she was working with were spending a lot of money on changing he, her, she, them, but they were migrant mothers who just needed visas to go and see their children, and they didn't care at all about that, about something that was much more practical and much more concrete. And that made her really, really angry. But I think, having said that, one has to also be critical of this kind of Eastern feminism, which is a superhero, like I can do anything, because women in Albania, and I don't know if this was the case in Yugoslavia as well, the cost of having this I am the agent, I can do anything, was that they would wake up at 5 in the morning and do all the cleaning and all the cooking and looking after the children. So they were burdened both at work and at home. And so it's not that the being employed solved the domestic oppression, it just added another lever, and they were just taking it. And as a result, I think one should really do a psychology of mothers of that generation, because they're very similar across the post-communist world. And there can be quite tough moms to have, at least I find with my mom. She's really hard because she's like, what are you complaining about? Just get on with it. And
yeah, I think we share that in all of ex-Yugoslavia as well. So as you can probably tell, I'm sure you can, Leah's book is not only beautifully written and extremely smart and manages to tell so many deep truths with such a ease and beauty, it's also really, really laugh out funny at moments. So I'm sure you're all going to love it and enjoy it. So I'm going to stop being selfish and ask all the questions. So I really encourage you to use this time. Okay, we have someone already.
Is this working? Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank you, both of you, for this wonderful conversation. I think this was very informative. A couple of days ago, I watched your Collège de France inaugural lesson, l'idée de socialisme moral, or the idea of moral socialism. I know we're talking about literature, but I'd like to, maybe if we can, maybe tie in with that idea, because I think it's very interesting. When it comes to your fiction writing, and we can talk about Free, but we can also talk about your newer novel, which is Indignity, which I think is a very fascinating novel. I know we don't have a translation of it, but I'd recommend anybody here to read it. It's a very interesting work of historical fiction. Do you think your philosophical ideas of, for example, the moral socialism, do you think it either consciously or unconsciously, depending on how you may interpret it, did it somehow motivate you to write the works of literature that you have written? Do they have some type of certain ideological underpinnings underneath the works? Like I'd quote Louis Althusser, who said something along the lines of, literature doesn't have knowledge in the strict sense of like scientific knowledge, but it makes us see and perceive and feel the ideology of the epoch in which the work was written. So I think that makes sense.
Yeah, so it absolutely does, but there is also the limit that I try to impose myself when I write literature, as opposed to say when I write my lectures for the Collège de France. And that's exactly the difference I was trying to start with between literature and philosophy. So of course my moral socialism starts from this critique of both Eastern European socialism and Western social democracy, and it's an effort to think about socialism in this globalized era where it's not enough to rely on the nation state, but you also have to have a critique of capitalism. And it's this kind of effort to bring together both my historical experiences and my knowledge, my philosophical commitments into the critique of society. And I'd say that there is a part of my literature that shares this trajectory, in that my literature is very critical. And so if you write critical literature, then this makes you aware of all the gaps everywhere. But the one bit where I try to very much discipline myself is not to make my literature the mouthpiece of moral socialism, for example. And in fact, if you read Indignity, you will have seen that one of the most important characters in the book is a Nazi. And the greatness of literature is that it's I think democracy in action. If you're trying to write convincing literature, you have to identify with every character. Even the worst character, even the one that fundamentally disagrees with you, because if you don't, then you write a mouthpiece, you write a propaganda piece. It's not literature anymore. And so if you're even like me, I'm a moral socialist. If I were to set out a novel that wants to prove moral socialism, it would just turn into a propaganda piece. And it wouldn't be effective. It wouldn't be effective as philosophy, but it wouldn't be effective as literature, because it would just write characters that become instrumental to the idea, where I think the contribution of literature is that characters breathe and make people explore the ambiguities, where I myself start writing this Nazi character, and at some point I have to think like him. And I have to show some understanding of what made him be that. Where is he coming from? Why does he have these commitments? What happened in his life? Why that his father died in a certain way and his mother died in another way? And there's all these biographical elements and social upbringing, psychological elements that you have to identify. And that's why I think democracy, the ideal of democracy, is that we have this empathy with each other. Every time we share and we discuss, we somehow try to understand where the other person is coming from. And literature does that, because when the writer tries, they enter the world of every character, and they see the world like that character, and they try to kind of write in that way. And if you were to abandon that, then I think the literature would not be very good. So this is where I have very, very firm boundary between when I write philosophy, where I'm like, here's moral socialism, here where all these perspectives are wrong and so on. And when I write literature, which is exactly the opposite, where even the moral socialist has to be flawed.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question.
Hello, thank you very much, and thank you for your time. I just have one question. So while listening, two thoughts came to my mind. History is written by winners, and history repeats itself. What are your thoughts on how to break that cycle in an oppressive society that's claiming it's not? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. These are both two very, very good questions, both of which are at the center of my latest book, which is a lot about the mechanisms of history writing and history production and the internalization and the manipulation of memory. And I don't think there is a clear answer or one convincing answer to that question. For me, the only answer that I have managed to come up with while writing that book, which is a lot about manipulation of memory and sites of ideological production in knowledge production, not just as ideology, as propaganda and so on, but in the way in which we read history, where we decide who is the good guy, who is the bad guy, who is responsible and so on. For me, the only way to overcome that is to pluralize writing of history, so to pluralize the perspectives, which is really hard because some perspectives, because of the victors making history, some perspectives just disappear. And so when I was writing this book, which is about my grandmother who was born in the Ottoman Empire, that Ottoman Empire world is just gone. It doesn't exist anywhere. It's not in the nation state. It's not in the perspectives that replaced it, which are all perspectives of resistance to this institution that did this and that to people. So the only way of recovering somehow, or trying to, is multiplying the sites of knowledge production and multiplying the perspectives from which you can then recover history. And I don't think that's something that one author or one book or one writer can do. That's the contribution of intellectual debate, broadly speaking. But where I'd say the only guiding principle is to pluralize the sites and to pluralize the perspectives, in hope that by pluralizing, you also generate these mechanisms of correction of these failed or biased standpoints.
Thank you, Lea, and thank you all for coming tonight to witness this unbelievable woman. Lea will be signing books in the bookstore area, so please hurry and grab your copy because you're in for the treat.